Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. Today's Tuesday, August the 5th, and we have this opportunity to spend the morning together. Trust you guys are waking up feeling refreshed and ready to begin a new day. Um, I can't believe how the summer is like moving by. It's already August the 5th. Can you believe that? But you could feel like in the air here now, it's you waking up, and it's in like the 70s. In fact, not even really sure what the temperature is this morning, but I know it was nice enough to go outside. Um, wow, look at that! Right now, it's saying it's 68. So, considering like where I came from for a couple, just a few days ago, out in South Carolina, it was pretty hot and muggy. So, I'll take the 68 any day. But it was nice for the respite, so I'm not complaining. But this morning we are in the midst of a series called Show and Tell, based on the major premise of what the story that we found in John chapter 4, where Jesus meets up with a Samaritan woman, and begins to engage her in conversation. Draws gives enough of doors of opportunity, let's say, for her to engage. Right? Jesus begins to ask her for a drink, and when she engages Jesus, it's with the typical way in which you would imagine for that day. Jews didn't talk to Samaritans, and men didn't talk to women, in the public square that were not their wives. It was just part of the culture, right? And so this prejudice, though it wasn't a good one, it's what existed in that day. And so when Jesus begins to speak to her, she's taken back. And then when he asks her for a drink from the well, not having any utensils of his own to draw the water with, she looks at him and says, How are you going to draw this water? And why are you asking me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? And so it sets the stage for you to realize that there is this engagement that Jesus is having with this woman that is out of the ordinary. And we should have been given a hint to that when you read in John chapter 4 that it says Jesus, leaving Judea, had to go through Samaria. Well, he didn't have to. There was other routes that were around, but he chose to go through Samaria. And there he has this encounter with this woman. During the course of that conversation, a couple of interesting things happen. And I just want to bring a couple of those back to your remembrance as we engage a little bit more on this whole topic of Jesus revealing himself to others. Right? There is a passage that I'd like to draw your attention to in John chapter 4. Okay, and in this passage here, let me just put this up on the screen here. So I want you to look at John chapter 4 and verse 27, because part of the story of Jesus engaging is, I want you to notice this. It says here, just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, What do you want? Or why are you talking with her? So while Jesus had this great conversation with this woman, and at the end of this conversation, Jesus now is revealing himself to her as the promised Messiah, this Redeemer, this Savior that was to come, and of which they had been talking about. Now, her eyes are open, and she's seeing Jesus in a much different way, not just as a man, a Jew, and not even just a prophet. Because remember, Jesus reveals to her things about her background that she was astounded that he would even know. And then Jesus corrects her and says, No, I am more than a prophet. I am the Messiah that is to come. And so it's at this juncture, if you were like a film editor, you build up to this one climactic scene, and then in the middle of that, the disciples come barging in, totally unaware of what's going on around them. And yet when they walk in, this climatic moment for this woman is now overshadowed by the attitude that the disciples are displaying, which, by the way, if you're paying attention to the story, is the same kind of attitude that the woman expressed towards Jesus, right? Remember in the beginning, like, why why are you, a Jew, asking me, a Samaritan, for a drink? When you don't even have any utensils of your own. In other words, you're not going to drink from my stuff. See, that same kind of attitude is now echoed in the disciples when they come and they look and they see her talking to Jesus, and yet none of them are asking, "What do you want?" or "Why are you talking with her?" Which, if you've been in crowds, right? You've been in situations and you have even the slightest amount of emotional intelligence. Sometimes you walk in and you could realize, like, "Oh, I just stepped into a middle of something here. I'm really sorry." It's like maybe you're at work and you come into your supervisor's office, and you could just tell that he's totally engaged in something else, and you're like, "Oh, hey, listen, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to disturb you. Right? I'll get back to you." Or have you ever gone to a party or some gathering and you don't really know anyone there? Maybe you know one person, and you're searching through the whole thing to look at them, but you get this distinct feeling that you're really not wanted, right? People just don't even see you. Well, this is what's happening to this woman. She had a fine conversation with Jesus, and now the disciples show up, and she could tell in an instant that they weren't too happy with this situation. And why do I say that? Because look at verse 28. In John 4, verse 28, it says, she left her water jar, and the woman went back to the town. So you see, like, she leaves the water jar that she came there for, and now she leaves, and she leaves right when the disciples come. What is that telling you? Right? It's obvious here that they made her feel more uncomfortable than Jesus did. I often smile to myself because I think that sometimes that's how it is in church world. Uh, People love Jesus; they just have a hard time with his disciples, and I can understand why, because I'm one of them. But listen, just like in the world, we're all works in progress, and the church is never going to be perfect, but we worship the one who is, and our desire is to be conformed more and more into his image. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time, right? And so here, the woman leaves. But my point that I really want to drive home today is, look what it says in verse 29. It says, when she leaves, she goes into the town and speaks to her friends, right? And what does she tell them? She says, come see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Christ? And they came out of the town and they made their way towards him. So now she's got her friends, right? They're all pretty excited about, hey, who is this guy? And I'm sure as she embellished on this story, it just piqued their interest. And now they have to come and find out for themselves whether or not Jesus is the Messiah that she's claiming that he is. And so this idea of, you notice what left this impression on this woman's heart was that, come and see the one who told me everything I ever did. Like, she was seen. You get that? Like this woman, um, she was seen by Jesus, and and that made all the difference here. So I want to give you an Old Testament example of this same kind of scenario. Because here's the thing. Very often, don't you ever find yourself wondering, man, I wish I was there to see all these things for myself. I wish I was a witness to these things. And because it would be so much easier to believe. Well, can I just, maybe I'm going to burst that little bubble a little bit, because the Bible is filled with people who were first, eyewitnesses. And yet, it's really interesting about our nature, isn't it? Have you ever found yourself in a very tight spot, and you're praying because you have no other options? You could feel the anxiety rising up inside of you, and it's almost like, what am I going to do? And you feel that sense of pressure and tension, and it just breaks you, and then you find yourself at your wit's end. And what's only left is for you to pray, and you kind of throw up this prayer like, oh God, help me. And then in the providence of God, a series of events unfold. And the next thing you know, you're out of that jam. And for that brief moment, you're like, oh God, thank you so much. I never saw that coming. I didn't even see that door that was hidden until you opened it. Yeah, that's happened to me countless amount of times. But this is the point that I'm trying to make with you, is that what's your attitude a day, a week, a month later? Don't we have this propensity within ourselves to sometimes forget? Like what God just did, man, it was amazing. Thank you, Jesus. And then a month later, it's like it never even happened. Yeah. This is exactly why we need to be reminded. We need it to be refreshed. But here's the other thing: there's going to be a lot of times that you don't have those personal eyewitness opportunities. So how are you going to be convinced of things? Think about that for a moment. There's a lot of things that we believe, but we believe because of indirect evidence, circumstantial evidence. But circumstantial evidence doesn't have to be diminished evidence. It just means that you weren't there to see it for yourself. So what you have to do is think, okay, are these accounts credible? Are they coming from a person who is reliable? Is there a uniformity to what is being said here? And now you begin to like test this evidence to see whether or not it's true. Well, one of the things in the Bible is that you and I are given you and I are given firsthand accounts from many people, and we have to read, and through those stories, we get an opportunity to learn something about God. It's the same way that we live out our lives, though. You're not going to experience firsthand everything, but sometimes you read something, and then you want to collaborate, corroborate that story with someone else. Like you want to make sure, like, did that really happen? It's like that on social media today, right? You listen to all these stories, and you're thinking, is that true, or is that just a headline? And if all you did was read the headline, you could easily be swayed into thinking certain things that just are not true. Or somebody has taken the truth and they've taken half of the truth and dressed it all up so that it leads you to fill in the blanks. And what you fill in is not really part of the story. And so consequently, when if the moment comes, the opportunity arrives where you recognize, wow, I've been duped. I've been sold a bill of goods, right? I mean, come on, that's happening every day of our life. People are misrepresenting. But my point with you is that the only way that we're really going to know something about the character and the purpose of God is to not only examine his word, but also through these stories, they're going to give us a glimpse. So what did we learn about Jesus engaging with this Samaritan woman? That Jesus wasn't playing this game of this prejudice that seemed to be so prevalent in their culture. He wasn't separating the Samaritans from the Jews, because he called out the Jews as easily as he did the Samaritans. You know, you and I are living in a day and an age right now where there's a lot of criticism being levied against the church, right? And they levy it against the church as a way to really undermine people's confidence in what Jesus has taught and said. And they're saying, come on, can you really believe this? Look what it says here in this Bible. And then they'll point to passages that are there, but they're wrenched out of their context, or they're drawing inferences from a text where if you were to examine the context of those passages, they're saying something completely different. And so my point is here is that you have to examine this evidence. And just like now, in John chapter 4, what do we learn about Jesus as we look through the text? Well, we learn that he had no time for this prejudice, either with the Samaritan or with his own disciples when they showed up. And he rebuked them too. It became a teaching opportunity for them when he says, listen, My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to complete his task. That's what I'm about. Is that what you're about? Because right now you're looking at this woman in a very prejudiced way, and you are not now fulfilling my Father's will. In fact, he would go on in this text, when those people were coming out of the town to engage Jesus, Jesus looked to them and referred to them as a harvest that is ready to be harvested. And he says, and so he looks at the disciples and he says, are you up for this task? Are you going to explain me to them? And this was all early on in their discipling process, right? So one of the things that you find from John chapter 4 is that Jesus is laying aside all these prejudices. He has a heart for everyone. That he's also one who is all about truth. But it goes even beyond that, because one of the things that I want you to get from this passage is that Jesus, in engaging in this woman, he's letting her know that I see you. I know you. And who doesn't want to experience that? You know, I remember I was going to Bedford prison. I was a young pastor, and I was being asked to go as a chaplain, and the King's College in Briarcliff Manor. Dr. Cook, you might remember him. He had a great radio program on. He would always start the program saying, "How in the world are you?" Right? Well, let me tell you a funny story about that. One day, I had asked Dr. Cook to come and preach at my church. It was in Tarrytown, New York, and it was not far from Briarcliff Manor, right along the Hudson there. And so Dr. Cook consented, and he was going to come down and preach the sermon that day. So I get up early and I'm going into the church and I'm looking around, setting things up. And I notice that there's a guy who's, really early, like, about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, he's early. And he comes in and he looks at me, he says, "Hey, is Dr. Cook speaking here today? Because I thought I heard that, on the radio, and I just want to make sure I had it right." And I said, yeah. I said, "He's going to be here later on today." And he says, "Oh, I love that guy. He's such a good Bible teacher." He says, I listen to his program all the time. I love it when he gets up in the morning and he says, "How the hell are you?" And I cracked up because that's not exactly what Dr. Cook, and if you knew Dr. Cook, he was a gracious man, right? But he would never have said that. And what he did say was, "How in the world are you?" It was his tagline for his morning show. But this guy says, "Oh, I love that guy." He says, "How the hell are you?" I just love when he starts his show. And so when Dr. Cook came, I said, "Hey, you got a fan out here this morning." And I told him that story, and he just like cracked up, But this is where I'm going with this now. So the King's College had a basketball team, and it was an all girls team, and Bedford Prison was an all women's penitentiary. And it was maximum security. So they had some hardened criminals there. And so part of the outreach of the college was that they would go and they'd play the inmates at Bedford Prison. And so this was one of the first few times that I've ever been, in that surrounding. And so they asked me, says, "Pastor, like when we go there, would you come with us and give the message in at halftime?" And so I said, "Sure, I'll go," not really thinking about what I was getting into. So let's see, maybe all of maybe 30, 35, maybe 34, something like that. So I go, and the first thing is that you go through this prison, and every time you go through a passageway, the door behind you gets locked. And it's such an eerie feeling, man. You're walking down these corridors, bars everywhere, and all you hear is like, doosh, doosh, all these doors locking and people coming. And it just to go, 100 yards, you had to go through this maze of security. And it was a little unsettling. And then when we get into this gym, we get there, and on one side are stands, and they have all the security guards. and then on the other side is just a bench with a couple of the girls on the teams. Right on one side is the inmates, on the other separated, and then you have the girls from King's College. And so when we're coming, I get to sit on the bench with the girls from the team, and so we're looking across the court at the bleachers, and then the inmates start filing in. There aren't any men around. I'm the only guy. And so now it fills up, and they have about, maybe like 150, something like that are there. And they got all these guards standing around. And man, it was a dark scene. I could just tell you that. And I'm sitting there, and now my palms are beginning to sweat because I'm thinking, what in the world am I going to do? So I'm sitting there on the bench, and then the game goes on, and I'm not paying any attention to this game because all I'm thinking is like, what in the world am I going to say to these people? And I'm rehearsing in my head, and then all of a sudden, it's halftime, and the guard comes over, grabs the ball, blows a whistle, gets all the women quiet, and he goes, "Hey, the pastor from the church wants to say something to you." And now I had to get up from the bench and walk across the court and stand in front of the bleachers, right? And the minute I get up and start to walk over, and now I know what a pretty girl feels like when she walks through a construction site. Because I'm just saying that it was kind of lewd. And I'm walking across this thing, and I am so embarrassed. I am now sweating profusely. And I'm sitting there wondering, what in the world am I going to say? And I was actually just taken back. And the more embarrassed they saw me, the bolder they got, and the guards are standing there, and they're blowing the whistle, trying to calm these women down. And finally, they settle down. And in that moment, the Lord gave me a reminder of something I had seen on my way into the prison. When I was walking through those halls, we passed the cafeteria where they would share meals, and there was a poster on the wall that was advertising a movie that the inmates were going to be watching, and the movie was it was called Mind Mapper. Yeah, what the theme of the movie was that this guy had invented a machine that you would put it on like a helmet, and what it would do, it would record not just your thoughts, but it would also record your emotions. It would record your all of your senses. So it could record what you're hearing. It could record what you're tasting. It could record what you're seeing, what you're thinking, right? And so you could see, like in the course of the movie, they what would happen is like that helmet gets into the wrong hands, and people could use it for nefarious reasons, right? And that's what they were afraid of. But one of the subplots in the movie was that this husband and wife were going through some real difficulties, and they never really seemed to be able to connect. And they were always like, they would start off having these conversations, and then they would blow up, and one would walk away angry, the other one would walk away crying. And it just was a mess throughout the whole movie. And yet you could tell that the guy really loved his wife and just had a very hard time expressing that. And so one day, towards the end of the movie, he sits there and he puts this helmet on, and he starts thinking about his wife. And then he takes the helmet off and he leaves her a note, asking her to put the helmet on and hear from him. And remember, I told you that the helmet, it recorded your thoughts, your emotions, everything. And then the scene was so, it just still, to this day, it still attracts me, right? Because the scene opens up where this woman comes in and she sees the note, and she kind of is a little snarky about it. And she gets busy, and then she just walks over, and she just reluctantly like puts this helmet on and sits down. And when she's listening and, experiencing the deep thoughts and feelings that her husband had for her, ways that he had not really expressed it before. And so it was for that brief moment where he was like inside her husband's head. And and all you see is the camera comes and the camera just zooms in on the face of this woman as she's sitting there listening, and the tears are just rolling down her face because she finally felt understood. She felt seen, right? And and so why am I telling you this? Because at that moment when I'm standing before all these prison inmates, I remembered that. And so I mentioned to the women, I said, "Hey, you guys were just um, you saw a movie this past week," and I told the name, and they're still chattering. And I said, and then I pointed to that scene. I said, "How many of you girls that watched that scene, you wish somebody understood you like that?" I said, "Maybe you wouldn't be in here today if you felt like someone really saw you, someone really understood you, someone, actually, instead of trying to get you to understand them, they spent the time trying to understand you. You would have had maybe a completely different outcome to your life. Maybe you would not have made some of the decisions that you made that resulted in your incarceration." And let me tell you, as I started to talk, these women now, they're listening, and it got deathly quiet. And the Lord just gave me a sense of boldness. And I just started talking to them. And I said, that was just a movie. But can I tell you about Jesus, who knows you, who knows everything about you, and who chooses to die for you and for your sin? And and I and I went back every year after that, and the women treated me so differently from that point on. And I was like, they were like, whenever they would have events at the prison, they'd say, "No, no, no, we want that pastor from Tarrytown." And I would come, and I would always have this great opportunity to talk to them about Jesus. Because you see, everybody wants to be understood. They want to be seen. Isn't that why Psalm, when you look over here at Psalm 139, um, look at Psalm 139, and let me just remind you again of the first few verses. It says, "O Lord, you have searched me, and you know me. You know when I sit down and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You're familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in, behind and before. You have laid your hand upon me. And such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain." My friends, this is Jesus, who now is talking to this Samaritan woman, and she walks away saying, "Come, meet the man that told me everything all the time." God bless you.